Right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I have the great pleasure of opening proceedings. So this is the second Climate Change and Insecurity Project's annual conference, and I'm delighted that this event is being delivered in partnership with the UK Ministry of Defence. Last year's conference focused on awareness, and this year's focuses on the role of defence. So we're kind of shifting the focus from understanding to response, delivery, and implementation. And I'm going to simply observe here that the IPCC risk framework has now evolved to recognise response and the centrality of response. Response, of course, carries risks. We need to be aware of that, and the lack of response also carries risks. So the mission, the challenge, is to find and deliver the right responses. I'll just park that for a moment. I want to say a few things about the Climate Change and Insecurity Project, or CCIP, just by way of introduction. This is a collaboration between the University of Oxford and CHASER, CHASER being the British Army's Centre for Historical and Conflict Research. CCIP has been in existence for just over 2.5 years now, so not a huge amount of time. That's only 4 British Prime Ministers. The project aims are quite straightforward. They're here on the slide. I won't go through each of them, but it's basically about getting people thinking about climate change, thinking about the threats, thinking about the mitigations at all levels. So that's those of today and those on the horizon. We want to bring the scientific and contextual state of the art to policy, doctrine and decisions. And as such, we kind of try to engage with parliamentarians, with government ministries, with the single services, and with multilateral organisations and many others. And this is us at present. It's quite a big team. At its core, there's Zia Morel from CHASER and myself from Oxford as directors, but also Louise Selizny, Tammy Evans, and General Richard as senior research associates. And in addition to us 5, we also have a team of other associates linked to the project from a wide variety of practitioner and research backgrounds. And they inform and produce specialist outputs, but they also ensure that we stay as relevant as possible. I'm kind of proud to say that we are responsible for a number of impactful outputs. Our website, which is detailed there on the slide, kind of goes into more detail, but outputs include the Climate Conversation series of podcasts, and assorted workshops, both kind of open invitation and closed, and invited lectures. We also put together training serials, exercise inserts and briefing papers. And last year we even ran a 2-day war game in Oxford for a documentary film on the securitization of water and food. That's called The Grab. We've collaborated with a whole range of different organisations on assorted projects and outputs. We see this as being really positive, and as someone put it to me the other day, when it comes to climate and security, it's who shares wins. And I think that's a good kind of moment to kind of jump back to discussing today's event. So let me say a few words by way of context. I think we need to start by saying the evidence for climate change kind of speaks for itself now. Anthropogenic climate change is happening and it's picking up pace. This means we are seeing, and we're going to see, further transformations to parts of the world. We're going to see water stress and climate shocks. We're going to see cascade threats to agricultural regimes. We're going to see spikes in food prices, stresses to food production and food logistics, We're going to see increased pest and disease presence, and probably inevitably, we're going to see not only shifts in diplomatic alliances, but also border disputes, mass population displacement, endemic famine, and warfare. The map on the bottom of the slide here shows the projected change in regional suitability for human habitation in 2070. And that's based on a warming scenario of 2 to 2.5 degrees. Now, some of us might expect some of these dark places, the kind of in red, such as North Africa, to kind of bear the brunt of the climate crisis. But lots of the other red parts, we need to remember, are not only densely populated areas, but also hugely agriculturally productive. So what will happen when these people can no longer feed themselves? What will happen when the trade from these places terminates? And don't forget that most people around the world are fed by trade rather than through their own soil. So this redness across this map is very alarming. And if we want to dig in a little bit, we can say, China buys vast volumes of grain from the US, and Australia is a huge partner in feeding kind of Southwest Asia. So climate change is going to kind of create a disequilibrium here that's going to have resonance kind of geopolitically. This graph makes clear that despite being aware of the threat and the challenge, this is the global we're not responding urgently enough. And there's a huge delta between the existing policies in red and the pledged policies in yellow in terms of carbon reduction. And there is a vastly bigger delta between those and the 1.5 and 2 degree pathways, which are in light and dark blue there. So in terms of response, it isn't where it should be. To these charts, I'd add this. It's apparent that the damage wrought by climate change takes place gradually and often invisibly. The resultant environmental degradation has by extension been of a slow pace, but it's nevertheless a form of attack. And we're starting to see that in kind of political narratives around the world. People are using climate and they're suggesting that it is that it is a weapon, and appropriate responses have to come into play. Now, people like Robert Nixon, he's coined the term slow violence to kind of describe this attritional lethality, this slow violence. And it is violence. It takes place over decades and sometimes over intergenerational time. Because it's slow, it's kind of been easy to ignore, but the recognition is there now that it's a powerful and existential threat, particularly to communities in the global south. So climate change has happened at a pace so slow as to be somewhat imperceptible until its current manifestations. And I think the best way to imagine this is through the metaphor that someone throws a rock in your direction, but instead of it hitting you, it kind of flies through generational time and kind of injures your child or your grandchild. Yeah. And we have to be conscious that the rocks have been in the air for some time now. We need to brace for impact, but we also need to stop more being thrown. And I think a big part of the solution is communicating to publics that anthropogenic climate change is a massive security problem. Think of it this way. If there was an adversary out there which was attacking your cities with floods, with fires, with bioweapons, which threatened to take away your drinking water, to destroy your agriculture and your food supply, and cause otherwise untold economic and human harm, what would the response be? The response would be war. It would be immediate war. So To respond with the necessary urgency, we need to change our gearing and thinking, and a somewhat modified security paradigm might be useful in that regard. Now, when it comes to climate security, as this slide shows, the understanding is there. The information is more than available. Now, there are those that deny this is happening, whether that's for political expediency, whether it's for economic opportunity, or simply because it's a psychological coping strategy, something like implicatory denial. There are many drivers of not looking up, but the evidence is clear. The climate challenge is enormous, the costs are vast, the effects at once complex and frightening. And indeed, some suggest the ability of humanity to dampen the effects of climate change may be more limited than we like to think, and in some cases and in some places, possibly even illusory. Now, we all know, well, those of us that work on climate security all know that climate change is a shaping threat. We know it's a threat multiplier. And as Thomas Homer Dixon made very clear at our conference last year, in some contexts, climate change is in and of itself already a significant security threat. And this is not just a matter for the global south. We mustn't make that mistake. So aside from the geopolitical risks and shifts, and more on them later today, we see domestic emergencies all over the world. So-called MACA operations, military aid to the civilian authority, have seen, for example, the British military being called upon to support emergency relief efforts and evacuations in Somerset in 2014, Yorkshire in 2015, Lincolnshire in 2019, Yorkshire again in 2020, and London in 2021. And this is a trend that's mirrored around the world. For example, in the past 6 months, militaries have been involved in flood and wildfire response, not only in the UK, but in the Emirates, South Korea, Uganda, Iran, Pakistan, the United States, Slovakia, Slovenia, Turkey, Germany, Spain, France, China, Cyprus, Portugal, Canada, Morocco, Mexico, Croatia, and Greece. And that's in the last 6 months. Other climate interventions have included Polish troops being deployed to clean up dead fish, the Swiss Army called in to airlift livestock due to heat exposure, and the Mexican Air Force attempt cloud seeding in an attempt to stimulate rainfall. So make no mistake, militaries are already on operations around the world because of climate change, and this is an escalatory trend. And of course, challenges are going to get worse. They're going to diversify. Climate change configures terrain, it configures weather, it depletes and shifts demand for resources. It makes capabilities obsolete and it strains infrastructure and equipment. It also amplifies risks, which can be exploited by adversaries and competitors. So huge problems for us all to think about and act upon, and we'll try to take some bites into this over the course of today. So shortly we will hear from the specialists and hear what they have to add. Today's workshop, which includes, I'm sure you'll agree, a stellar cast from the research and practitioner sectors, asks in session 1, how does climate change impact the security landscape and what are the implications for defence? Session 2 explores the ways and means of anticipation of different climate impacted futures. The coverage in session 3 includes defence resilience and capacity building. And finally, session 4 concerns adaptation and examines climate security and policy making, diplomacy, and the threat assessment process. And Blair Brimmel from the Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence will offer this year's closing keynote. At this point, I'll just share a few quick parish notices. Respective session chairs will introduce speakers. All the timings on the slide here are in GMT. Session 1, 10:45 a.m. Session 2, 12 p.m. Session 3, 1:45 p.m. Session 4, 3 p.m. and the closing keynote at 4 p.m. Can I ask that delegates type their questions and any comments that they have into the Q&A function? If you'd like, as part of that, to state who you are and where you're dialing in from, please do so. That's always helpful, but in no way feel obligated to do so. To note, recordings are being made, and those lightly edited versions of those will be made available after the sessions, probably a few days hence. I'll also add that this is a virtual event, so we may get some technical gremlins. If connections or technology try to derail us, please be patient. We do have contingency plans in the mix. I think, though, that we're all agreed, not least given carbon boot prints, busy schedules, and just numbers of people involved, that virtual conferencing is very much the future. As a final point of welcome, I'd like to say thank you to our speakers and chairs, and of course to our delegates. There are over 600 of you online today. I also know that we have academics and service personnel dialing in from as far away as Australia and Canada and Jordan and Kenya. So good evening, good morning, whatever works for you. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. So we will move now to the main event. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce James Clare, who has kindly agreed to deliver the opening keynote address. I'll just quickly introduce him. James is the Director of Climate Change and Sustainability at the UK Ministry of Defence. His responsibilities are many and cover delivering MOD's climate change and sustainability ambitions, ensuring that Defence is adapting and building resilience to the impact of climate change, and working to kind of mitigate Defence's environmental impact. Additionally, James is responsible for climate security policy and looking at the direct and indirect impacts that climate change is having both on Defence force structure as well as causes of instability around the globe. Since joining the Ministry of Defence in 2003, James has worked across the department in DE&S, Air Command and Head Office. He deployed to Afghanistan on Herrick 10 as the policy advisor to Commander Task Force Helmand, and he spent 2 years as private secretary to the Chief of the Air Staff. At other points in his career, he oversaw the management of the MOD estate and was Deputy Director Finance, Military Capability, (Infrastructure). James, CCIP are delighted that you accepted our invitation to speak, and for the next 17-18 minutes, the virtual floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks very much, Tim. I hope you can hear me. So my first thing straight away is I probably need to get a different profile picture, but thank you very much, Tim. And you've already seen the chat. It was a really great opening, really good context. It just sets out the problem, the challenge, and what we're all trying to strive to achieve. So as Tim said, I'm James Clare. I'm the Director in the UK MOD responsible for climate change and sustainability. I now have other responsibilities as well, but that's my key focus. Tim's already mentioned my role is focused on ensuring that Defence is adapted to and is resilient to climate change. But in doing that, I need to work with our single services. I need to work with our enabling organisations to basically upskill and build their awareness as well. So we all work together to go away and address the challenges, be they adaptation, be they mitigation, or be they new policy areas such as climate security. But today I hope to give you an overview of climate security, a bit about the role of Defence, and I'm just going to reinforce that you have got a great list of speakers who can get into the detail later on. So up front, I just want to make 3 key points. First, climate change and the global response are already reshaping the physical and strategic operating environments of our armed forces and our defence ministries. These impacts are also contributing towards global geopolitical uncertainty, making many of the threats we face more complex and more challenging to resolve. Second, the security implications of climate change matter for defence and indeed the wider security community. And the third point I'd like to make is that this is a whole system issue. You heard it before in Tim's opening. This requires all players within the system to act. Our contribution must form part of a wider response, which includes defence, development and diplomatic action. And that goes back to the sharing, the transparency. The information we all need is the same. We need to find that way of working. We need to exchange ideas. We need to share our approaches. So we know the world around us is changing. The strategic context is more fraught, fragile and fragmented than ever before. Recent global events have exposed vulnerabilities to cascading systemic risks, as well as highlighting the security ramifications of the transition away from fossil fuel-based energy sources. The impacts of climate change are also all around us. We're seeing these manifest in different ways in every region of the world. Tim, I was so impressed with the list before. I cannot reel off the same level of countries and nations and timescales. But for me, in July, UK temperatures continuously surpassed 40 degrees C for the first time on record. It drove a rise in hospitalisations. It triggered widespread fires, including across our own training areas, including Salisbury Plain. And it caused severe disruption of our transport infrastructure. Extreme flooding events are also increasingly testing our national resilience. This was very apparent, for example, in Western Germany and Eastern Belgium in July 2021, when flooding caused by heavy rainfall killed more than 220 people. This summer, Europe experienced its worst droughts in 500 years. The resulting crop failures have contributed towards rising food insecurity by compounding already high food prices. And again, reinforcing a point that Tim made, between June and August of this year, Pakistan received nearly 190% more rain than its 30-year average. Its government declared a national emergency. More than 33 million people were affected. 1.7 million homes were destroyed, and an estimated £26 billion of financial losses were caused, with further economic disruption expected. All these events and their compound effects were made many times more likely due to climate change, which is now occurring at a pace much faster than previously forecast. Looking ahead, rising global temperatures will contribute towards even more climate variability and volatility, whether by driving higher temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, or leading to more frequent, intense and extreme weather. And these are just the direct impacts. Second and third order consequences of climate change will include increased food and water scarcity, displacement, migration, and humanitarian and economic crises. Climate change will also erode capacity to respond to shocks. I believe the private sector are actually getting this. It was interesting but not surprising to see climate change top AXA's list of emerging risks and most concern for the first time this year, followed by geopolitical instability and cybersecurity risks. This year, climate action failure, extreme weather and biodiversity loss ranked as the top 3 most severe risks in the World Economic Forum's agenda-setting global risk report. So, what does this mean for defence? First, it's worth recognising that our armed forces are already engaged on the front line of the global response to growing insecurity, whether that be contributing towards national responses to more frequent and severe weather events at home or abroad, or working alongside our allies and partners to tackle the geopolitical and conflict, as well as instability-related threats that climate change impacts are compounding. This covers a wide range of activities, from deployments to assist civil authorities in providing flood relief to local communities, as UK personnel did in West Yorkshire during Storm Dennis, which was in 2020, to supporting HADA, so humanitarian assistance disaster response activities, such as the Royal Air Force's transportation of UK military aid packages to Pakistan. But there are perhaps less obvious examples, such as UK's contribution to multilateral stabilisation activities, our role within the UN stabilisation mission in Mali, for example, where climate change has already affected natural resource-based livelihoods and contributed to undermining human security in a complex environment. Our allies and partners, of course, face the same challenges. The Canadian Armed Forces' response to natural disasters has roughly doubled every 5 years since 2010. For example, this September, nearly 500 military personnel were deployed across Canada in response to Hurricane Fiona. But looking forwards, Climate security pressures will have profound operational implications across all our domains. This will include where we operate, what we need to operate, how we operate, and of course, who we operate with. An increasing number of reports by leading security think tanks, such as the IISS, so International Institute for Strategic Studies, have highlighted that in addition to the greater demand for HADA, a large proportion of military operations are now likely to be in environments made more fragile by climate change. The impact of climate change may also lead to the increased demand for defence to undertake other interventions, such as countering illegal wildlife trade, deterring piracy, and prohibiting illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. But as the world transitions away from fossil fuel-based energy sources in favour of cleaner, more sustainable alternatives, there may also be a role for defence in responding to any potential new threats that are brought about by this transition, whilst also securing our sources of energy. This transition will create new supply chain dependencies and also potential choke points. Increased competition to dominate new energy sources, the technologies needed for the clean energy transition, and the critical minerals required for such technologies also risk spurring new strategic rivalries. Where such challenges arrive, they will likely have implications for our defence diplomacy. We will need to understand how such dynamics are impacting regional partners and to ensure that our engagements with affected countries are sensitive to such pressures. A disorderly transition can also lead to tensions, of course. For example, there are issues already over who bears the most responsibility for reducing emissions and paying the costs of impacts that are already baked into the system. Who is responsible for national adaptation? Who is responsible for global adaptation? One likely consequence, according to a recent report by E3D, may be growing interest and investment in geoengineering approaches. Now, geoengineering sounds like science fiction, and that's probably because it is, but I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future, in which some of these issues are explored further. But there are also near-term challenges, illustrated vividly by their inclusion in the US intelligence community's National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change and Responses to its Impacts, which was published almost a year ago. And of course, there is a greater and growing set of reports being both produced internally and outside of government, which are increasingly alerting us to the new reality. Namely that in addition to changing operational demands, climate-related security risks are also shaping the broader geopolitical and security landscape within which we must operate. It's already straining existing international security arrangements. It's already creating new geostrategic flashpoints. A really good example of this is China. It is already the most exposed country in the Asia Pacific in terms of the number of climate disasters and the number of affected people. By mid-century, roughly around 85% of China's population will be exposed to climate-related hazards. Such hazards are already costing the Chinese economy billions of yen annually and are causing major disruptions to human settlements and activities. Researchers at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute are among a growing community of analysts that are highlighting that climate change will increasingly influence China's economic, foreign, and security policy choices over the next decade and beyond, if not already. These impacts surely deserve greater attention. We need to understand how climate pressures will impact food, water, coastal cities, energy demands, health security, and also what all of this means at an aggregated level means for the country's internal stability and how that country, how that region, how their partnerships will respond. Existing assumptions about what is influencing our adversaries' behaviour may also need to be updated. In many respects, climate change can therefore be described as a meta issue. It is a backdrop that shaping influence against which all activity will take place over the coming decade. The speed with which we continue to integrate climate change considerations into our strategic assessments, our strategies, our policies and planning will therefore be vital to our ability to either stay ahead of future threats or understand their implications. So I hope it's really clear that climate change matters for defence. And the good news is that this is being increasingly acknowledged and recognised, not just in the UK, but across the world. In the UK, our Defence Command Paper, issued in March 21, in parallel to the UK's integrated review, identified climate change as a transnational challenge that required a collective action alongside biosecurity risks, terrorism, and serious and organised crime. This is a point reinforced by the recently released US National Defence Strategy. The first Sea Lord speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in June described climate change as an existential threat to all of humankind that far outweighs in gravity any threat that we as a species may be doing to each other around the world. And also, the NATO Sec-Gen, speaking at the NATO summit this June, recognised climate change as a crisis multiplier and the defining challenge of this time. And NATO's leadership on this issue is both welcome and key. To paraphrase a recent analysis by the European Leadership Network, at a time when war rages at NATO's doorstep and the collective defence coupled with rising defence spending is at the centre of everyone's attention, agreeing with allies an ambitious programme on climate security deserves recognition. NATO in itself has strong convening power and has set a really high level of ambition, which is to be the leading international organisation when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change on security. At the Madrid summit in June, the NATO Sec-Gen also reaffirms NATO's commitment to reducing military greenhouse gas emissions and announced concrete targets for NATO as an organisation. While the previous NATO strategic concepts adopted in 2010 made limited mention of climate change, the newly adopted document has dedicated 2 paragraphs to the impact of climate change on security, which is strong synergies with how we have been framing the issue in our own national context. We view NATO's efforts as setting the bar for all member states, placing climate security and sustainability issues at the heart of their national defence and security mandates. And that's essentially exactly what we've been doing in the UK. My team and I are currently focused on driving change by raising awareness and increasing literacy across defence and our wider whole force, including our suppliers, including our reserves, including our contractors, taking a whole force approach. Building the shared understanding of the threat and also honing thinking about defence's role in tackling it are a key priority for me alongside our wider work on climate change, mitigation and adaptation. To give you an example, earlier this year we teamed up with colleagues at Loughborough University and the US-based Centre for Climate and Security and set out an agenda for future research on climate security. We identified several priority challenges. The first one, how are the climate and other ecological crises affecting geostrategic decision-making? Next, what are the geopolitical security and conflict ramifications of responses to the climate crisis, and to what extent can these be anticipated and or mitigated, and through what means? How will climate change and responses to its impacts also affect the ways in which defence and security forces operate? And finally, how can we best build capacity within academic and policy-making communities and empower them to meet the challenges of a warming world? This last point in particular encompasses the work to increase literacy and strategic competence on these issues and identifying the skills that future leaders will need to cope with the multi-layered challenges posed by climate change. And I also know that this is going to be raised later on today. Supporting the design and delivery of events like today's conference, aimed at strengthening ties between academic and the defence community, therefore represents a key part of our efforts to progress thinking around each of these priority challenges, as are supporting the development of other initiatives, such as the NATO Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence, CASCO, which will be launched in Montreal next year. It's great that we have Blair from the Government Affairs Canada speaking later on as another keynote speaker about her work, and the work of her colleagues are leading to build this new centre, to build a research programme. We are generally really looking forward to the prospect of working alongside our allies and partners on this issue, and very much expect that the CASCO will become a key hub for knowledge and learning. In fact, most of our allies and partners are already doing outstanding work to progress this agenda and really do deserve recognition. This includes Australia. Australia are in the process of producing a national intelligence estimate on the implications of climate change for national security. This April, for instance, the French Ministry of the Armed Forces released its climate and defence strategy, which also recommended developing knowledge and foresight and increasing international cooperation. Climate change has also featured prominently within the US National Security Strategy and the Arctic Security Strategy, both released in October this year. This follows the release of several service-level climate action plans and strategies from the US Air Force and the US Army, which follow on the back of the US Navy's one earlier this year. So there is really lots going on, and there's an awful lot of fruitful exchanges that are taking place bilaterally as well as multilaterally. For instance, again, in last month's Berlin Security Conference, there was an awful lot of conversations around how climate and wider environmental insecurity really are the security threats that bind us all together, Again, it all comes back to, it is a shared challenge. The information we all need is the same. How are we going to work this through? But we also have a significant amount of work to do. We need to share that information. We need to turn this discussion into greater cooperation and turn the cooperation into action. As I mentioned already, climate change and the global response are whole of system issues with security implications that just transcend multiple policy areas and departmental boundaries. What is required is therefore a whole system response involving defence, but also wider development and diplomatic lines of effort. We are definitely not proposing here that climate change can be solved through security means, far, far from it. But we are acutely aware that climate change and its impacts will affect our national and international security, and that people, organisations and institutions responsible for preserving that security. We must therefore adapt to ensuring that the security implications are understood and are being embedded across the breadth of activities that occur within the defence and security community. Put simply, we need to make sure that the security implications of climate change are codified into the defence psyche. Otherwise, we risk being blindsided by the nature and timing of future crises and having a false sense of security. I started off by saying that the global strategic landscape is changing. It is. Climate change is a key driver of the more turbulent global context, and it's within this evolving complex that the UK, our allies and partners now need to adjust in order to maintain our advantage. Defence is no exception, and at present risks to the UK and our global interests resulting from climate insecurity are neither fully understood nor incorporated into policy fully. What we have is an opportunity to be the change and to put into place a new paradigm, one of which, responding to the security implications of climate change, are a central task. The window to act, however, is rapidly closing. It requires a step change in our approach. Without this, we may weaken our ability to develop effective responses, undermining our preparedness, readiness, and resilience to future crises, as well as the ability to anticipate and prevent them. I know last year's Climate and Insecurity project focused on describing the problem. I'm really hopeful that today's event will provide ample opportunity for us to test and stretch our thinking about how defence must now assess, anticipate, act and adapt to meet the challenge of the changing climate. I am really looking forward to listening to today's speakers. I'm certain that today's discussions will be rich and will generally help us to mature ideas about what our role is as part of a wider national response to this growing threat of climate insecurity.